I'm just going to come right out and say it. Dragon Quest II is underrated. You know, I had some real reservations about covering Dragon Quest II. I've been a fan of the Dragon Quest series for the longest time, despite playing only a handful of the games to completion. After lightly flinging one's fingers over the keyboard, you'll notice one Google search later that Dragon Quest II flies under the radar as one of the less liked entries in the Dragon Quest series. Nearly every ranked list placed Dragon Quest II firmly towards the bottom, perhaps beating out the ongoing elusive Japanese exclusive Dragon Quest X or the basic yet trailblazing Dragon Quest I. Now, I'd not played Dragon Quest II before going into this video and was genuinely rather worried that I would end up not liking it enough to want to do a video on it, considering this series is dedicated to those special games that I really like. Thankfully, I'm happy to report that, at least with the Nintendo Switch version of the game, I actually had a fantastic time playing it. Turns out that a pretty bad Dragon Quest game is still a pretty good video game after all. Who knew? When I was playing through Dragon Quest II, two words kept coming to mind. Those words were iteration and innovation, which I feel will become a common theme as I play through the rest of these games, going forwards in numerical order. I will discuss in detail how Dragon Quest II iterates and innovates over its predecessor over the course of this review. Dragon Quest II Luminaries of the Legendary line originally launched in January 26, 1987 in Japan as Doragon Questo Akuryo no Kamigami and as Dragon Warrior 2 in the United States on October 30th, 1990. It has since gone on to receive a plethora of different ports and remakes over the years, and for this review I used the 2019 Nintendo Switch version of the game. Let's take a look. The main difference between Dragon Quest II's story and that of its predecessor is that it actually has one. Dragon Quest took on a rather tell-not-show approach to its storytelling in that you started the game dropped directly into your character's POV with the king simply saying, "Our neighbour over there's a bit of a bugger, isn't he? Go and sort him out, would you?" Dragon Quest II, however, opens with an actual cutscene in which you can see firsthand the evil deeds of this entry's villain, the High Priest Hargon. The castle of Moonbrook is laid to waste by his forces in a totally unprovoked attack, killing almost all of its inhabitants, including its king, and cursing the princess, transforming her into a canine. A lone soldier survives, limping all the way to the player's home city of Maidenhall, informing its king, your father, of what went down, before finally succumbing to his wounds. He also speaks of Hargon's intention to summon the Dark Lord of Destruction, implying that we truly have no idea of what he's really capable of. I certainly appreciated the no-nonsense simplicity of Dragon Quest's pacing and gameplay, but this here is absolutely a better way to start a video game. Right from the get-go, you've seen what's at stake here, so have a much more concrete motive for thwarting Hargon's plans. After this, the game starts rather similarly to the original Dragon Quest. The king gives you a pep talk, a copper sword, a pat on the back, and sends you on your way. One notable difference this time, however, is the task you're assigned of gathering allies. Turns out you aren't the only one descended from the legendary hero. Recruiting the Prince of Cannock and the Princess of Moonbrook will become your first two objectives in the game, introducing the party system to the Dragon Quest series for the first time ever. Recruiting the Prince of Cannock is a little bit of a hassle, as he gives you quite the runaround, having to retread quite a bit of ground as he's also looking for you. Thankfully, if you know what you're doing, finding him is quite easy. NPCs will continually point you in the correct direction should you talk to them, and you'll eventually intercept him in the small town of Leftwyn. There is a little bit more of an adventure involved in recruiting the princess, seeing as she's currently indisposed, sniffing around the rubbish bins and begging for scraps. Thankfully, one quick acquisition of a magic mirror later, and she's back to normal and ready to function as an incredibly useful red mage. Dragon Quest followed a common theme regarding the notion of the damsel in distress, in that you'd simply rescue her and then carry her home to safety. In Dragon Quest II, the princess has agency, joining your party and dealing out incredible damage with some spells or potent healing with others. That's innovation. She's a nice counterpart to the main hero who has all the magical capabilities and personality of a sack of charcoal. Having now played right through and beaten the game, I'm still not entirely sure what the Prince of Canuck's role is meant to be. Please feel free to enlighten me in the comments. Regardless, once your team is assembled, the game takes on a very similar theme to the first game. Explore the open world, acquire better weapons and equipment, and eventually prevent the resurrection of Malroth, taking down Hargon in the meantime. The world of Dragon Quest II is genuinely rather huge, or certainly feels that way in comparison to the first game. Torland is a sprawling map featuring multiple continents and island chains, all ripe for exploration. In a particularly cool twist, Dragon Quest I's land of Alefgard is also present, though somewhat scaled down, and I thoroughly enjoy getting to pay Tantegel Castle a visit to see how things had changed over the last 100 years. I had initially wondered if the Dragon Lord's castle was once again going to set the stage for the final boss, like some kind of recurring dungeon, but alas, it simply lay in ruins. The design philosophy of exploring the world in Dragon Quest II largely remains the same for the most part. The first couple of hours are largely linear, simply because you can't access anywhere overseas and must go where the land takes you, conveniently towards your other party members. Shortly after recruiting both teammates, however, you'll unlock the ability to sail a ship, truly opening up the world of Torland and allowing you to explore it at your leisure. In much the same way that the first Dragon Quest had wooden bridges to denote when enemies would get tougher, in Dragon Quest II, it's more a case of reaching a whole new landmass. I will say that this totally open world approach is a little bit more detrimental in this game than it was in the first, though. Dragon Quest did somewhat lack direction, but there were only so many places that you could go on a relatively confined map, so it wasn't too difficult to work out what to do next. The world of Dragon Quest II is colossal though, and as there's barely any signposting, it can simply result in sailing around here, there and everywhere in the vain hope that you'll find the one NPC that gives you a hint as to where you can go next. To this end, I'd thoroughly recommend playing Dragon Quest II these days with a guide, or 2 guides. Maybe even 3. Seriously, sometimes this game can get so obtuse that I literally had to start cross-referencing several text guides, dungeon maps, and even YouTube video guides. And that was for the Nintendo Switch version, which has the most in the way of quality of life improvements. Having said all of that, I do still love the world of Dragon Quest II. It does feel far larger in scale than the first game, not just in terms of size, but climate too. Alefgard was a single continent, and an almost exclusively temperate one at that. Torland is far more diverse, with grassy plains, expansive deserts, and even a vast snowy mountaintop that houses Hargon's domain. There are also far more settlements, and different kinds of them too. Dragon Quest I ultimately had 5 or 6 towns, depending on whether you count Tantegel as 1 or 2, and that was about it. Dragon Quest II features 11. They aren't all simply variances upon the same kind of medieval walled city either. Sure, the first handful of locations such as Maidenhall, Canuck and Leftwyn appear to have been taken straight from the original game, but then you'll find the tropical village of Zahan, the underground city of Burrowell, or the city of Buran, a magical settlement that sits upon a lake. The developers used the solid baseline of the original game and proceeded to let their imaginations run wild, making the world of Torland just a little bit less uniform and all the livelier for it. Upon making the most sweeping of generalizations, you could say that on the surface, Dragon Quest II looks and plays exactly like its predecessor. However, despite being heavily built on the robust mechanics of the first game, Dragon Quest II takes it one step further. Upon leaving the starting castle of Maidenhall, I was promptly accosted by a slime, much like in my playthrough of the first game. Besides noting that the background art was suddenly much better and wider, nothing seemed particularly out of the ordinary, and I dispatched the little bugger quickly. However, I was promptly thrown into another random battle, this time with 3 slimes. That's right, in Dragon Quest II, the monsters can form their own parties too, even before you get to. Whilst this can make certain fights harder, I certainly didn't find it too unfair, at least not in the early game. On the topic of random battles though, it does bear mentioning that wow, they are way overtuned. Frequent was the occasion where I'd have just finished a battle, taken approximately 3 steps forward before being jumped by yet another gang of monsters. Honestly, you'd have a harder time walking through the hills and dales of Torland uninterrupted than you would the streets of Kamurocho. On the bright side, I will say that because I ran into so many fights, simply getting from A to B, I rarely felt the need to stop and grind for money or experience, except for approximately an hour or so right at the end of the game. The general gameplay loop is quite a bit more refined in Dragon Quest II as well. You can start to see the foundations of the individual town arc narrative, which becomes a staple of the series later. What I mean by this is that the hero and crew will show up at a town, discover that they have a problem that needs to be solved, usually involving something at the bottom of the nearest dungeon, before solving it and moving on. You can see the seeds of it here, such as finding the cursed princess at Moonahan before having to retrieve the information on where to find a special mirror in the dangerous ruined city of Moonbrook, before returning to her, curing her, and then moving on to the next part of the story. Having a full party in Dragon Quest II certainly mixes things up a little from the first game. You may note that, unusually, the hero has no magical abilities whatsoever, with the option to flee where casting spells would be. It is at this point I realise that the hero is basically Rincewind from Terry Pratchett's Discworld. As such, the responsibility of spell slinging falls to your companions, who are fortunately quite a bit more proficient in the arcane arts. The princess gets some very potent spells such as Kaboom, which hits every single enemy on screen, as well as a full heal, and the ability to resurrect a dead teammate with Kazing. Regarding the prince, I meant what I said earlier about not quite knowing what to do with him. Sure, he gets some useful spells like Kabuff, which raises everyone's defense, but otherwise he just feels like a lesser version of his peers. He can equip a lot of the same armor and weaponry that the hero can, but doesn't have as much strength, and can cast several magical spells like the princess, but they simply aren't as good. Also, he gets ill randomly when you stay at an inn one time, and it's a bit of a faff having to use your single Yggdrasil leaf to revive him, especially as you're only able to carry one at a time and have to make the pilgrimage back to the tree to grab another afterwards. Anyway, regarding the dungeons of Dragon Quest II, they're somewhat more of a mixed bag. The dungeons of Dragon Quest I were nearly all simply labyrinths, distinct only by their colour scheme. Dragon Quest II has a few different kinds, ranging from caves, towers, and evil castles. I rather liked the changes early on, as I felt that there was a bit more variety, both in location and floor planning. However, one dungeon in the game stands out as a particular pain in the neck, and almost caused me to start a brand new YouTube series entitled Throwing a Wobbly. I'm sure seasoned veterans of Dragon Quest II know exactly what I'm talking about, and as it stands, it has caused me, at the very least, to make this brand new segment dedicated exclusively to this part of the game. So I'm talking about the Road to Renderak, otherwise known as the Road to Rome in earlier releases. The Road to Renderak hurt my feelings. Here's the thing about the Road to Renderak. It's hard, like really hard. Way harder in fact than any other dungeon in the game before it. The reasons for this are threefold. Reason number one, it's huge. It's a very long dungeon without any real clear indication of which way you should be going. Honestly, I'm not going to expand on this point too much because this wouldn't really be too much of an issue if it wasn't compounded with the following factors. Reason number two, the traps. As well as taking a while to get through even when you do know where you're going, the Road to Renderak has some very nasty tricks up its sleeve to keep the player from having too much fun. We wouldn't want that now, would we? For one, there are infinite loops. You could simply keep trying to go in a certain direction and never ever get anywhere, which could take you a little while to notice, especially as a lot of areas in this dungeon look the same. As well as this, there are lots of pitfall traps, sending your characters tumbling back several floors with no way of accounting for them until you've already fallen through. Again, annoying, but compounded further by my final point. Reason number 3, the random encounters. Much like the rest of the game, the random battles are way too frequent, bogging you down very quickly and forcing you to drain all that valuable MP just to fight the monsters off. When the dungeon is already as long as it is, compiled with how many times you're probably going to have to retread the same steps due to its complexity and number of traps, it can very easily feel like you simply aren't getting anywhere. Not to mention that when you finally get out of the dungeon and emerge blinking in the sunlight of the admittedly very cool looking mountain plateau of Renderak, the monsters here are even harder, and there's still quite a walk to the nearest safe zone. Thankfully, I managed to make it there upon my first try, but if I died and had to make another attempt at the road to Renderak, then the game would have had me all like... At long last, upon surviving the road to Renderak, Renderak itself, and the commute to Hargon's palace, you'll find yourself in Maidenhall? That doesn't seem right. Alas, this Maidenhall ends up turning out to be a fiction, a fabrication conjured up by Hargon to deceive the party, and is dispelled via using the Eye of Rubis, revealing Hargon's castle for what it truly is, unlocking the final dungeon in the game. Weirdly, I would say that it's easier to get through than both the road to Renderak and even Renderak outside. There are several mini-bosses to get through, but the various regular monsters really aren't that much of a pain at all. Once you've tackled the castle and his various minions, the battle against Hargon begins. Much like the Dragon Lord's first form in Dragon Quest I, Hargon is essentially just some bloke with a funny hat and a robe, so falls fairly quickly. However, in his dying breath, he's able to summon the God of Destruction and one half of the Dragon Quest Builders 2 beautiful bromance himself, Malroth, in the form of another cutscene. This proves to be a bit of a trickier fight, requiring some strategy, albeit a relatively basic one. When I fought him, the hero largely kept attacking. The princess would cast Kasap to lower Malroth's defences, as well as Kaboom for some extra damage, and the prince would cast Kabuff to keep our defences up and die repeatedly. Seriously, man! Eventually, Malroth falls, and the world is at peace once more. A very cool feature of Dragon Quest II, which I believe was also in the first game, is the ability to conduct a victory lap, travelling around all the various towns and speaking to their inhabitants, celebrating your victory, massaging your ego, and welcoming in a new era of peace. Pro tip: pay the ruined city of Moonbrook a visit before you return to Maidenhall. There's a secret and rather moving cutscene to be found there. As it was in Dragon Quest I, the final act of this game is simply to return to where it all started. In this case, the castle of Maidenhall. The king will congratulate you and your comrades before handing the kingdom over to you. Unlike the first game, this time your character actually accepts the king's offer. So ends Dragon Quest II, a surprisingly fun but flawed game. Despite its reputation and my own reservations, I'm very happy that I decided to give it a go. Narratively, it rounds out the original trilogy of Dragon Quest games, though is of course succeeded by Dragon Quest III, a prequel to both 1 and 2 that I'll absolutely be covering in the following months. As I said in the beginning, Dragon Quest II both iterated on the first game and innovated on it even further. On paper, it's the perfect sequel, with practically more of everything. More story, more characters, more monsters, more towns, and more abilities. Of course, perhaps it is a little bit of a victim of its own ambition, as the imbalance of the final few sections of the game is supposedly due to a development crunch, trying to fit way too much into the game in too short a time. Whilst I now may find myself agreeing with the consensus that Dragon Quest II is one of the weaker entries in its series, it's still a brilliant game. I will reiterate, however, that it's probably best experienced on the Nintendo Switch following a guide or two. It may still have that weird sprite aesthetic, but mechanically it has been sufficiently rebalanced from the supposedly nightmarish original. Seeing how far Enix came from Dragon Quest 1 to 2, I'm incredibly excited to try out Dragon Quest 3, as I have yet to play it properly as of the time of writing. Having said all of that, please consider joining me next time when I'll be talking about a different game. We'll be jetting off to a tropical sun-soaked island before getting falsely imprisoned by some dodgy justice system and stuck with community service. Oh, and we'll be playing a video game too.